Hi, I'm Chris Walsh with the Bush Institute's Human Freedom Initiative, and I'm honored to welcome David J. Kramer, who is the Senior Fellow at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, and before that, spent some time at the U.S. State Department, notably as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, dealing specifically with countries like Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. So let's dive into the discussion. David, thanks for doing this with us today.
You bet.
I think a lot of people have seen headlines about what's going on in the former Soviet Union, particularly around Belarus, but I don't think they've gone much beyond a headline or a video on Twitter or Facebook. So given all this media attention that's going on in Belarus, can you break down exactly what is happening and why?
So Alexander Lukashenko has been in power since 1994. He actually won an election that was largely judged as free and fair. And he has been in power ever since, including by rigging previous elections in 2006, 2010, and he did so again August 9th of this year. And the people of Belarus have, not surprisingly, gotten sick and tired of him. He handled the pandemic, which has afflicted Belarus quite seriously, in a terrible way. He basically told people to go ride tractors, to go in a sauna, drink vodka. He was incredibly dismissive of the pandemic and the threat that it posed to the people there. And he also has left the country in a terrible state of affairs, very dependent on Russia for energy and other needs. He's increased the role of the state in the economy up to about 75%. And he has carried out very brutal authoritarian means to stay in power, including cracking down in the past that prompted the West, the European Union and the United States, to impose sanctions back in 2006, again in 2010. And I think the likelihood is that sanctions will come back after events of August 9th. The election that took place on August 9th, there were several people who tried to register as candidates. Lukashenko not only denied them registration, but then threw them in jail. The wife of one of them, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, actually decided she would run in place of her husband, who had been arrested and thrown in jail. And Lukashenko, for whatever reason, decided, well, why not? I'll let her register. Lukashenko is a misogynist pig and probably felt a woman isn't going to pose a threat to me. Well, sure enough, she sure as hell did. And she and several other women rallied tremendous support throughout the country in a very brief period of time during really the month of July. And there was huge turnout at her campaign events. And then come August 9th, there are pretty clear indications that she actually won a majority of the vote. And yet the Central Election Commission and Lukashenko claimed that he won 80%. And the people of Belarus decided that was enough. That was the final straw for them. And then that led to the demonstrations that we've been seeing ever since.
Now, it seems that if needed, Russian President Vladimir Putin has agreed to intervene militarily against the protests on behalf of Alexander Lukashenko. Will Russia make good on that offer? And what would that mean for Belarus and for Lukashenko?
I think the Kremlin isn't quite sure what to do yet. There's certainly an element where Putin does not like to see like-minded leaders driven from power. He has kept Assad in power in Syria. It's one of the reasons he went into Ukraine after Yanukovych was decided he had to flee and go to Russia. Putin doesn't like to see popular movements leading to a critical point where these leaders feel they have to leave. That poses a dangerous precedent for Putin himself. He worries that there will be a wave that will go from Georgia to Ukraine to Belarus and then to Russia. At the same time, these protests have had no anti-Russian sentiment at all. They haven't had pro-Western sentiment either. In Ukraine in 2013 and 14, you saw the protesters out in the Maidan waving EU flags. And there was pretty strong anti-Russian sentiment because Moscow had sided with Yanukovych, the previous president. In Belarus, you're not seeing any anti-Russian chants or any slogans like that. And the hope is that Moscow will understand this is not a geopolitical competition. This is not between the West and Moscow. And so the goal should be to try to convince Moscow to leave the people of Belarus alone, to recognize that Lukashenko is not the legitimate leader, and that there should be a rerun of elections. Now, I'm not terribly confident that this epiphany will take off in Moscow. But my hope is that the officials in the Kremlin will realize that any overt move to prop up Lukashenko, to send in forces across the border, will in fact trigger an anti-Russian backlash, and it will backfire very badly on Belarus-Russian relations. So Moscow actually could do itself a favor by recognizing that Lukashenko's time is up. The majority of people in Belarus want to change. And if they could facilitate his departure, even offer him safe haven in Russia, actually that would engender a lot of goodwill among the people in Belarus toward Russia.
Now, I know you mentioned there's not a Russian sentiment and there's not necessarily a pro-Western sentiment in these protests. But that being said, how should the United States and the European Union and other democratic nations respond to the protests generally and the threat of Russian intervention more specifically?
Well, this is a country of 9.5 million people that borders Russia, Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And so it borders not only Russia, but it borders several EU and NATO member states. And it's an incredibly strategic location. It's important for transport of various types of economic activity. And so the United States and the European Union, in my view, should recognize that the people of Belarus at enormous risk. Think of the beatings and the torture that people who have been detained have had to endure after going out protesting against Lukashenko's efforts to steal this election. We should stand with the people of Belarus and recognize that they have said Lukashenko's time is up. We should not recognize the official results as legitimate, and we should join them in their call for a new election. We should also try to work with the Russians, not above the heads of the Belarusians. They need to be involved, but work with everyone involved to make it clear that the people of Belarus have spoken. We should recognize what they say, and we should support their efforts in trying to bring some form of democracy to Belarus, a country that has lived otherwise under this dictatorship for the past 26 years.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and look more specifically at Russia and something else that has been in the headlines recently. It was confirmed in Germany, actually, that Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned. So who is responsible for this? How do we know that? And why did they do it? And what does it mean for Russia's democracy movement?
Well, ultimately, Navalny's poisoning lies at the feet of Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. Whether he ordered this or not, we don't know. I think there's a possibility he did not order this specifically. But there's an element of who will rid me of this troublesome priest in Russia, where people around the Kremlin and who are looking to ingratiate themselves to the Kremlin will carry out specific acts against Putin critics and Putin opponents, thinking that this might actually be what the Kremlin and what Putin wants. So there have been a number of assassinations, poisonings, attacks against critics of the Kremlin, against opposition figures, against journalists, from Boris Nemtsov to Anna Politkovskaya to Vladimir Kara-Murza to Alexander Litvinenko in the UK. It isn't as if the Russian security forces and those who carry out these activities limit themselves to within Russia's borders. They carry these out beyond Russia's borders as well. And so Putin not only condones this kind of activity and behavior, he encourages it. So he bears ultimate responsibility, I would say, even if he is not the one who specifically said, go make this happen. The same applies for the murder of Nemtsov. There's large suspicion that the leader of Chechnya was the one who was behind that. And that presumably was done because he thought this is what Putin wanted. And this is what happens in these kinds of regimes where the number one leader speaks derogatorily about other people, and then people infer from that they're supposed to carry out the leader's wishes without knowing specifically that this is what they wanted.
David, let me close out by asking you, stepping back again, looking at a more 30,000-foot view, why should protests in Belarus or the poisoning of a Russian opposition leader matter to people here in the United States?
The way regimes treat their own people is often indicative of how they'll behave in foreign policy. And so when we look at Mr. Putin's attitude toward the human rights of his own people, where he doesn't respect them at all, where he cracks down, where he engages in repression, then he's not likely to respect the human rights of people in Ukraine or Georgia or Belarus, nor is he likely to respect the concepts of sovereignty and territorial integrity. He's also likely to act out beyond Russia's borders, either to deflect attention when there may be protests inside Russia, such as coming to the support of a leader like Assad in Syria, again, a like-minded leader that Putin doesn't want to see fall, or he may engage in other kinds of aggressive activity that poses a threat. Belarus is a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's a much smaller place. It poses less of a risk to us directly. But when people in Belarus, again, at enormous risk, go out and demand better for their country, out of a shared common values and principles, I think we have a responsibility to stand with them. It's not to say that we should send in the US military. No one's arguing for that. But we should look at the possibility of more sanctions to make life more miserable for leaders like Lukashenko, who have lost any sense of support within the population. And we should also recognize that leaders like Vladimir Putin pose a threat to us. And again, it comes back to the type of regime that is in place in these countries. When you're an authoritarian leader, you're not only likely to crack down inside, you're likely to strike at forces outside. And I think that's what we've been seeing for a number of years under Russia with Vladimir Putin in charge.
Well, David, thank you. Appreciate your time and your analysis on what's going on in the region.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Pleasure.